This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 408, The Strongest Man in England. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, you are one of the strongest men I know from a resilience perspective.
Oh, well, but that's why I selectively buy and use the most powerful antiperspirants.
They're working. They're working.
Thank goodness.
Can't keep me away. Well, this is an interesting episode ahead. It was suggested to us by Peter McIntyre, one of our listeners. And Peter, to thank you for inspiring us on this topic, we will be sending you a little something in the mail. If you'd like to be like Peter and come up with a brilliant idea that Bert and I are clearly so lacking in, we would welcome your participation, and we would thank you with some kind of Sherlockian gift. Just email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And of course, to have you supporting the show means the world to us. Thank you to those of you who support us on Substack and Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you too can join these wonderful people who help us do what we do, keeping the lights on, keeping the editing software going, and all the rest. I guess keeping the brain juice flowing too. That's been drying up lately, so we need to replenish that. And you do that by going to the links in our show notes that'll take you to Patreon and Substack. And of course, by all means, visit us at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Drop your email address in there, and we'll update you via email when we've got new content as well. To the people that contribute, that support us financially, we have bonus content for you. We have your name automatically being entered in a drawing for free back issues of the Baker Street Journal. You have time to get your name in before the next episode, but you can be entered for that random drawing if you are a supporter. So thank you in advance, and let's get right to it. Okay, Bert, the strongest man in England. There seem to be a few contenders for this. I know Peter wrote to us, and he had a very specific person in mind. But before we get to Peter's suggestion, why don't we run through some feats of strength in the canon? Even though this isn't Festivus season yet, we can talk about feats of strength and strong people.
Well, it's a great topic, and when you look through the cases of Sherlock Holmes with the idea of finding people who are defined by their strength, it's amazing the number. I mean, just pause, folks, and think to yourselves, 56 short stories, 4 novels. Who looms large to you as being defined by their physical strength and power? And a good place to start is almost at the very beginning with the scandal in Bohemia, when we have the entry of the King of Bohemia. And we remember him for a variety of things, but not least of which is his size. A man entered who could hardly have been less than 6 feet 6 inches in height, with the chest and limbs of a Hercules.
Hercules! That, I didn't really pause to consider his height. I mean, I always remember the chest and limbs of a Hercules, but 6 feet 6 inches, my goodness. That could very well be the tallest person mentioned in the canon. Maybe we should do another show on height.
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah.
Bookmark that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a formidable man coming in, of course, in his in the style of dress, a heavy bands of astrakhan slashed across the sleeves, and the double-breasted coat, the deep blue cloak, and of course that mask that he wore. Really a formidable person in their presence.
Yeah.
Well, we know about another formidable presence who made an entrance, I think that astounded not only Holmes, but Watson as well. I, of course, am talking about Dr. Grimsby Roylott and the Speckled Band. We have Holmes and Watson talking to each other after Helen Stoner has left. And Watson says, the ejaculation had been drawn from my companion by the fact that our door had been suddenly dashed open and that a huge man framed himself in the aperture. His costume was a peculiar mixture of the professional and of the agricultural, having a black top hat, long frock coat, and a pair of high gaiters with a hunting crop swinging in his hand. So tall was he that his hat actually brushed the crossbar of the doorway, and his breadth seemed to span at least across from side to side. The large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun, and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance of a fierce old bird of prey. What an entrance.
It is. It's a magnificent entrance. And it's useful to point out that Arthur Conan Doyle, the literary agent, was particularly focused on physical strength and size. In fact, when Sandow, who but to some people was known as the father of bodybuilding, staged a bodybuilding contest in 1891, Conan Doyle was one of the judges. And this has to do with sort of an aspect of Conan Doyle's personality that we seldom remember or talk about. But he had some concern about his weight and made a diary entry in around 1898 that he weighed 224 pounds, and he was, which is 16 stone, and he was 6 feet 1 inches tall. And later that year, he embarked on what he described as a course of muscular development with Sandow, Eugen Sandow, the bodybuilder. And so when Sandow staged this contest, Conan Doyle was one of the judges, but Conan Doyle, paid attention to building up muscular strength, among other things. He was, involved in lots of sports. And
that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, it is interesting. And the echo, the compliment to the appearance of Grimsby Roylott in Baker Street is what Holmes does, because, of course, Grimsby Roylott bending that poker, he steps swiftly forward, seizes the poker, bends it into a curve with his huge hands. And then Holmes, if he had remained, I might have shown him that my grip was not much more feeble than his own. And as he spoke, he picked up the steel poker and, with a sudden effort, straightened it out again. And so there, you've got this very much anything you can do, I can do better kind of contest in Baker Street.
That's astounding. Well, and for anyone who's tried to unbend a wire coat hanger, You know how difficult that is. And to do it with your arms outstretched, I think it takes more strength to unbend something than it does to bend it. But that leaves a distinct impression on our canonical brains. Well, when it comes to strength, I think there's another couple of people later in the canon that we run into. One is someone only referred to through the storytelling of the main client. And of course, I refer to the veiled lodger. And we know that the tragedy took place at Ronder's circus. Ronder, of course, was the circus manager, and there was Jimmy Griggs the clown. There was Mrs. Ronder, who was horribly disfigured, and of course there was Leonardo. Well, what do we know about Leonardo? He was
it's quite a description, because when we're hearing the story from the veiled lodger, she takes a photograph and shows it to Holmes and Watson. He was clear. It was a photograph of clearly a professional acrobat, a man of magnificent physique, taken with his huge arms folded across his swollen chest, and a smile breaking from under his heavy mustache, the self-satisfied smile of the man of many conquests. That, she says, is Leonardo.
Leonardo the strong man. I'm just picturing it's so stereotypical. You know, the Victorian gentleman with his hair slicked down, parted in the middle, the Pringles mustache, and the one shoulder strap of a leopard skin onesie as he's holding up a barbell with two spheres on either end of it over his head. You know that image?
Yeah, that's great.
That's the stereotype that I'm picturing. But yeah, Leonardo was the strong man. But of course, we know he was strong in body but weak in character, and unfortunately left Mrs. Ronder to suffer the injuries from the lion that was loosed upon them.
Yeah. Strong in body, but poor in spirit. And then there's another great character that strolls through the world of Sherlock Holmes, and that's in Lady Frances Carfax. And here, Watson has traveled outside of England, and the search is underway for Lady Frances Carfax. So he's in France, and through the open sitting room window, he sees a huge, swarthy man with a bristling black beard walking slowly down the center of the street and staring eagerly at the numbers of the houses. I rushed out and accosted him. "You are an Englishman." "Oh, well, so what if I am?" he asks with a villainous scowl. And then Watson says, "Where is Lady Frances Carfax?" The fellow gave a bellow of anger and sprang upon me like a tiger. I have held my own in many a struggle, but the man had a grip of iron and the fury of a fiend. His hand was on my throat and my senses were nearly gone. Before, Sherlock Holmes darts out from a cabaret opposite with a cudgel in his hand and frees Watson. And that, of course, is the Honorable Philip Green.
I like that. What a scene that is. Holmes running to Watson's rescue there as Watson was being besieged by Philip Green. By the way, I didn't realize Sherlock Holmes enjoyed cabaret. Nice.
Yes, yeah, he'd always like to stop in for a show if there was nothing going on at the Royal Albert Hall.
Cabaret. I thought it was Cabernet. Either one. But yeah, we have, of course, another instance of Holmes springing to Watson's defense with Killer Evans trying to take Watson down, or shooting Watson in The Three Garridebs. But this show of strength, this physicality with which Philip Green turned on Watson was something that was pretty startling. And fortunate that cooler heads prevailed. So this brings us, I think, to our final person that we're talking about in terms of sheer physical strength. And this is the person who was recommended to us by
Peter
McIntyre. I'm thinking of the story. Well, the story is Black Peter. And of course, there's a wonderful opening of that story, which I so enjoy. Watson says, "I've never known my friend to be in better form, both mental and physical, than in the year 95. Right? So this sets us up. And I think so many of the stories that appeared in that collection of the return of Sherlock Holmes, that post-Reichenbach set of short stories, a number of them took place in 1895. And of course, Vincent Starrett so wonderfully sets our minds always in 1895 in his wonderful poem 221B. But it was in this year 95 that Holmes was under assignment, and he had been, coming and going from Baker Street. And one morning, Watson said that there was an investigation, and there was an indication that the investigation was taking an extraordinary turn. Holmes had gone out before breakfast, and I sat down to mine when he strode into the room, hat upon his head, and a huge barbed-headed spear tucked like an umbrella under his arm. Good gracious, Holmes, you don't mean to say you've been walking about London with that thing? I drove to the butcher's and back. The butcher's? And I returned with an excellent appetite. As one does when one's at the butcher. But what was Holmes doing at the butcher in that time that he was out?
Well, he had acquired a recipe book of European food and was practicing shish kebab. But he got the scale completely wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
It was a matter of translation. He thought, we were dealing with huge carcasses rather than little cubes of meat. I would have thought the eggplant would have cued him in on that, but no.
Well, he was. He says if you could have looked into Allardyce's back shop, you would have seen a dead pig swung from a hook in the ceiling, and a gentleman in his shirt sleeves furiously stabbing at it with this weapon. I was that energetic person, and I've satisfied myself that by no exertion of my strength can I transfix the pig with a single blow. Perhaps you'd care to try? What a nice friend, offering Watson the opportunity to attempt transfixing a pig. Before we get into the strength that's required for that, I want to point something out, and this really comes from the world of physics. And I don't know if any Sherlockian has done this research over time, but the idea of a pig or whatever, a body swinging from a hook or from a rope and trying to transfix it. Well, you can picture in your mind how it would swing away naturally. Newton's laws, body in motion stays in motion, transfer of force, etc. But for an individual who had 2 feet on the ground, who I think would be much more solidly located, that's a very different type of response that you get when attempting to transfix that individual. And when you think about how Patrick Cairns must have approached this, even as a harpooner, it wasn't necessarily throwing the harpoon across the cabin, because the cabin wasn't that big. He could have had it in his hands, kind of perched over his shoulder as if he were going to throw it, but then started to just basically ram it through Peter Carey's chest and backed him up many steps until he hit the wall and then shoved it right through. And apologies for the grisly exposition there, but I'm just thinking of the physics of all of this. It still takes a lot of strength, but from a practical standpoint in transfixing someone to a wall, it's pretty significant.
Well, there are 2 things to consider there. The first is the weight of the harpoon coupled with the velocity of Carnes's throw. And so if you have a very heavy harpoon, and I no doubt the harpoons were very heavy because Conan Doyle had experience on an Arctic whaler, it's that combination of Carnes's muscular strength, the velocity that he could produce even in a small space by propelling this very heavy harpoon, forward. So that's one thing to think about. And the second thing to think about, of course, is that after he did that, what happened to the wallpaper?
It had an interesting new pattern.
Yeah. Boy, I think it would have been hard to patch. It really would have been.
Yeah.
Particularly those Victorian patterns. It would, just to cut another piece and put it over there.
Yeah. Well, just to give our listeners a sense as to what it looked like in that room, we have, was it Stanley Hopkins that was?
Yes. Yes.
He's retelling the tale. He says, well, I have fairly steady nerves, as you know, Mr. Holmes, but I give you my word that I got a shake when I put my head into that little house. It was droning like a harmonium with the flies and blue bottles, and the floor and walls were like a slaughterhouse. He called it a cabin, and a cabin it was, sure enough, but you sure would have thought that you were in a ship. There was a bunk at one end, a sea chest, maps and charts, a picture of the sea unicorn, a line of log books on the shelf, all exactly as one would expect to find in a captain's room. And then there, in the middle of it, was the man himself, his face twisted like a lost soul in torment, and his great brindled beard stuck upwards in agony. Right through his broad breast a steel harpoon had been driven, and it had sunk deep into the wood of the wall behind him. He was pinned like a beetle on a card. Of course, he was quite dead, and had been so from the instant that he had uttered that last yell of agony.
Yeah, wonderful Gothic image there that's very visible and compelling and memorable for readers. Well, but we never really find out a lot about Patrick Carnes, really. We know when he shows up in Baker Street, he was a man of remarkable appearance, a fierce bulldog face framed in a tangle of hair and beard, and two bold dark eyes gleaming behind the cover of thick, tufted, overhung eyebrows. He salutes and stands sailor fashion, turning his cap round in his hands. And then, through a little discussion, Holmes is convinced this is the man he was looking for, and handcuffs are put on him. And the next instant, Holmes and the seaman were rolling on the ground together. He was a man of such gigantic strength that even with the handcuffs which Holmes had so deftly fastened upon his wrists, he would have very quickly overpowered my friend had Hopkins and I not rushed to his rescue. So there you have it, the power of Patrick Carnes.
Yeah, and to think that Hopkins thought that John Hopley Nelligan, this waif of a youth, was responsible for it. Holmes really set him right before they knew exactly who they were talking about. He described these attributes of Carnes. He said, Hopkins, have you tried to drive a harpoon through a body? No? Well, surprise, surprise, right? Tut, tut, my dear sir, you must really pay attention to these details. My friend Watson could tell you I spent a whole morning in that exercise. It's no easy matter. It requires a strong and practiced arm. But this blow was delivered with such violence that the head of the weapon sank deep into the wall. Do you imagine that this anemic youth was capable of so frightful an assault? See the man who hobnobbed in rum and water with Black Peter in the dead of the night? Was it his profile that was seen on the blind 2 nights before? No, Hopkins. It's another and more formidable person for whom we must seek.
Poor old Hopkins. He was standing there listening to all of this and thinking to himself, well, I guess it was a case of suicide.
Have you ever tried to commit suicide with a harpoon, Hopkins? No? You ought to try it sometime. Oh, goodness. Well, I think Peter makes an excellent case for giving us Patrick Carnes as the strongest man in England. And I can't think of anyone else who would fit that bill.
No. And that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What a very amiable person. I may not be quite so bulky, but